This video is brought to you by NordVPN. In the last few days, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been flooding from northern to southern Gaza in anticipation of the IDF's looming ground invasion. With a humanitarian crisis looming, all eyes have turned to Egypt and the Rafah border crossing, which is now the only way in or out of Gaza for both Palestinians and humanitarian aid. Both the UN and the US have been pressuring Egypt to at least partially reopen the border, but Egypt isn't so keen on the idea. And on Monday, a provisional deal collapsed after Egypt accused Israel of undermining it. So in this video, we're going to explain why the Rafah border crossing has become such a big deal, why Egypt is reluctant to open it, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, this story really starts on Friday, when Israel announced that the 1.1 million or so Palestinians living in northern Gaza and Gaza City had just 24 hours to get out of the territory, presumably in advance of the looming ground invasion. While a full-scale incursion is yet to materialise, and IDF officials have since said that they recognise any evacuation will take more than 24 hours, a ground invasion still looks overwhelmingly likely, given that hundreds of thousands of IDF troops are currently deployed around Gaza's northern border, and Netanyahu said on the weekend that the recent airstrikes were, quote, only the beginning. Accordingly, the UN estimates that some 600,000 Palestinians have started fleeing south. But both Palestinian rights groups and the UN have been warning that the south of Gaza is both too densely populated and too poor to properly accommodate this many people. Gaza's overall population density is already pretty high, at about 5,800 people per square kilometre, or about the same as that of Greater London. But this number obscures the fact that certain urban areas in Gaza are amongst the most densely populated in the world. Parts of Gaza City in the north and Khan Yunis in the south, for instance, have a population density over 30,000 people per square kilometre, higher than that of Manhattan. If southern Gaza were to receive the 1 million or so Palestinians currently living in northern Gaza, it would double the region's population in the space of a few days, and imply a population density far higher than anywhere else in the world. The UN also argues that southern Gaza is far too poor to cope with such a massive influx of refugees. Nearly 50% of all Gazans are unemployed, and the annual average wage for those that are employed is just $2,400. The south actually has the highest poverty rate in all of Gaza, with 55% of Palestinians in Rafah living under the poverty line. This is especially true now that Gaza is under siege from Israel. While Israel has restarted water supplies to southern Gaza, they've still cut off electricity, fuel and food supplies, and reports suggest that hospitals in the region are already running at capacity. The head of the UN Refugee Agency warned that an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding under our eyes, and the UN said that hospitals in southern Gaza were likely to run out of fuel by Monday. Accordingly, calls have grown for Egypt to open up the Rafah border crossing, which connects southern Gaza to the Sinai Peninsula. Before the war, there were basically only 3 functioning crossings in and out of the Gaza Strip: the Rafah crossing in the south, the Erez crossing in the north, and the Kerem Shalom crossing, which sits at the junction of the Gaza Strip-Israel border and the Gaza-Egypt border, and is only really used for commercial traffic. There used to be a bunch of other crossings on the Gaza-Israel border, but Israel gradually shut them down after Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, and the Erez and Kerem Shalom crossings have since both been closed as part of the recent siege. This means that Rafah is the only functioning crossing, but Egypt closed it when the war broke out. This was in part because Israel was firing missiles at targets in Rafah, but it's also because Egypt has reasons to be wary of taking in a significant number of Palestinian refugees. First, Egypt is already suffering through its own economic crisis, and President Sisi has reportedly said that Egypt will need financial help from the West to take in a significant number of Palestinian refugees. It's also worth saying that Israel makes it very difficult for Palestinians to return to Gaza, so any refugees would have to be housed indefinitely. Second, Egypt worries that a significant influx of Palestinian refugees could create a Hamas offshoot in Egypt. This could, in turn, destabilise the Sinai Peninsula, where Egyptian security services have been fighting a jihadist insurgency since about 2013. To be fair to Egypt here, in the past, when Palestinian militants have set up shop in nearby Arab countries, it hasn't ended well. For example, when the PLO moved to Jordan in the late 60s, they ended up fighting a civil war against the Jordanian army just a few years later. And when they moved to southern Lebanon in the late 70s, they really didn't get on well with the locals and ended up provoking an Israeli invasion and occupation of the area in 1982. But the third and perhaps main reason Egypt doesn't want to completely open the border is that Cairo has long suspected that Israel's long-term plan with Gaza is to essentially relocate the Palestinians living in Gaza to Egypt, paving the way for an Israeli occupation and Gaza's eventual integration into Israel proper. Several Israeli politicians have proposed creating an alternative Palestinian state in the Sinai, an idea Egyptian officials have always rejected. And in 2017, former President Hosni Mubarak claimed that Netanyahu himself actually proposed the idea back in 2010. Anyway, on Sunday morning, there were reports that the US had brokered a deal that would let humanitarian aid into Gaza via the crossing and let foreign and dual nationals out. But the crossing hadn't opened by midday on Monday. And on Monday afternoon, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry put out a statement essentially blaming Israel for holding up humanitarian aid. For context, while Egypt has control over the crossing, supplies coming into Gaza through Rafah require Israeli approval under the 2007 agreement signed after Hamas took control of Gaza. This means that there's now a queue of trucks with humanitarian aid on one side of the crossing, who had been promised entry and then denied at the last minute. What happens next is an open question, but given that hospitals are due to run out of fuel by the time this video is out, if nothing is agreed, a humanitarian catastrophe is essentially guaranteed. With news like this constantly filling the headlines, it's easy to feel like the world's getting less safe. Fortunately, when it comes to your digital safety, NordVPN has your back. It's an unfortunate reality that online scams and phishing attacks are on the rise, with us constantly bombarded with emails from our banks, social media accounts, and annoying newsletters we forgot we even signed up to. It's easy to click the wrong thing. One weak link can compromise security and bring things crashing down. With the protection of NordVPN, though, you can use their threat protection features to identify potential suspicious links. Even if you did reach a suspicious website, NordVPN's data encryption tools would protect against a number of other attacks, like malicious man-in-the-middle breaches. Even if things do go wrong, NordVPN's dark web monitoring is always scanning for your details and passwords, and can actively notify you before you even notice. Plus, if you sign up to a 2-year plan using our link, you'll not only get a massive discount, but you'll also get 4 extra months totally free. We've been told that sometimes when people hear us talk about NordVPN, they open up a new tab and start searching, but they don't use our link. I'm certainly glad that they do use the service, but you only get the discount and you support the channel through that link. So if you're trying to improve our journalism by signing up for Nord, use our link when you do, and you'll get their great service at a discount.